behind the radiant smile of Maria in West Side Story lies one of the most ruthless, cold-blooded psychological orchestrations in Hollywood history. The world fell in love with Natalie Wood's face, entirely unaware that the studio executives had orchestrated a humiliating deception to steal her voice, exploiting her relentless work ethic before discarding her soul. But this massive corporate betrayal was only the final act of a lifetime of abuse. To understand how a global movie star could be so easily manipulated, you must realize she was conditioned for it by her own mother, a calculating woman who intentionally infected her toddler with a paralyzing phobia of dark water to control her, forced her to work through a shattered wrist, and built a spectacular career on a foundation of pure terror that eventually swallowed her whole. The destruction of Natalie Wood began with the unfulfilled, desperate ambitions of her mother. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in San Francisco in July 1938. Her parents were Russian immigrants who had fled the violent, bloody chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution. Her mother, Maria Zakharenko, was a woman entirely consumed by aristocratic delusions. She had grown up amidst the romanticized grandeur of pre-revolutionary Russia, only to find herself living a harsh, impoverished reality as an immigrant in the United States. Maria was bitter, calculating, and absolutely determined to escape the crushing anonymity of the working class. Maria Zakharenko was the ultimate extreme manifestation of the Hollywood stage mother. But unlike mothers who simply want their children to succeed, Maria viewed her daughter not as a human being, but as a financial extraction tool. She projected her own desperate, unfulfilled dreams entirely onto her second child. The psychological justification for this exploitation was rooted in a chilling piece of family lore. Years earlier, while living as a refugee in Harbin, China, Maria had consulted a Roma fortune teller. According to Maria, the mystic looked at her and delivered a highly specific prophecy. Your second child will be a world-famous star, but beware of dark water. A normal protective mother equipped with this information would take immediate practical steps to ensure her child's safety. A rational parent would enroll their daughter in swimming lessons, teach her to respect the ocean, and provide a secure environment where water was a natural, manageable element. Maria Zakharenko did the exact opposite. She looked at the prophecy and saw a business plan. She weaponized the fortune teller's warning. From the time Natalia was a toddler, Maria intentionally and systematically instilled a profound, crippling terror of deep water into her daughter's fragile psyche. She did not just warn her to be careful, she created an omnipresent, invisible monster. She repeatedly told the little girl that the dark water was actively coming for her. She made her terrified of the ocean, terrified of deep pools, and terrified of the unknown depths. It is vital to analyze the deeply sinister pathology behind this parenting tactic. This was not an act of misguided maternal protection. It was a calculated act of psychological control by inventing a deadly, inescapable threat, a monster that only the mother could supposedly identify and ward off. Maria ensured that her daughter remained utterly dependent upon her. A terrified youth does not rebel. A terrified youth clings to her mother's skirt. Maria used this engineered phobia as a psychological leash. It guaranteed that as she dragged her young talent from audition to audition, pushing her into the terrifying high-pressure world of adult film production, Natalia would never run away. She would remain compliant, desperate for her mother's approval and protection from the dark water that was always waiting just out of sight. When the Zakharenko family relocated to Santa Rosa, California, Maria began aggressively positioning her daughter in front of camera lenses. The timing was crucial. The American film industry of the 1940s possessed a ravenous appetite for young performers. The studio system, operated by ruthless moguls who ruled their lots like sovereign dictators, did not view these youths as vulnerable individuals requiring education and play. They viewed them as highly lucrative miniature adults who could circumvent standard labor laws. The studios actively relied on stage mothers like Maria. The executives did not want to get their own hands dirty disciplining a young cast member. They needed the mother to act as the enforcer, the middle management of relentless pressure, ensuring the performer hit their marks, memorized their lines, and never complained about the grueling 14-hour workdays. Maria was more than happy to play the role of the enforcer, trading her daughter's formative years for proximity to wealth and power. Natalia's entry into the Hollywood machinery was swift and brutally efficient. In 1946, she was cast in Tomorrow is Forever, starring alongside cinematic titans Orson Welles and Claudette Colbert. Welles, a genius who deeply understood the mechanics of performance, was profoundly unnerved by the young actress. He famously described the young Natalia as a terrifying professional. She did not act like an ordinary youth. She was hypervigilant, preternaturally focused, and capable of weeping hysterically on command. What Welles was observing was not natural acting talent, it was a trauma response. Natalia was performing for her life. She knew that her mother's affection and her family's financial stability depended entirely on her ability to cry perfectly for the camera. It was during this initial entry into the studio system that her very identity was ruthlessly erased. The executives at International Pictures, specifically William Goetz, looked at the name Natalia Zakharenko and decided it was entirely unacceptable for an American marquee. It was too ethnic, too complicated, and too foreign for a post-war American audience. They did not ask the young performer for her preference. They did not consult her heritage. The studio executives unilaterally stripped away her Russian identity and rebranded her as Natalie Wood. The name itself is chilling in its pragmatism. They named her after the director Sam Wood, but the surname Wood perfectly encapsulates how the industry viewed her. She was a piece of timber. She was raw material, a wooden commodity to be carved, shaped, sanded down, and sold to the public. She was no longer a young individual with a family history. She was a manufactured product. This total eradication of her birth name was the first major betrayal inflicted upon her by the Hollywood system, but it was actively sanctioned by her mother. Maria did not fight to protect her daughter's heritage. She eagerly discarded the Zakharenko name, viewing it as a necessary sacrifice on the altar of fame. By that point in her youth, she had been entirely consumed by a dual matrix of control. At home, she was governed by the terrifying prophecy of the dark water and a mother whose love was strictly conditional upon her box office success. At work, she was governed by powerful men in suits who owned her name, controlled her image, and treated her entirely as corporate property. She was a massive star in the making, generating immense wealth for everyone around her. Yet, internally, she was completely hollowed out. She was navigating a deeply adult world of contracts, lighting cues, and financial pressure, armed with nothing but a crippling anxiety disorder and a mother who was willing to push her into any danger, so long as the cameras were rolling. And as Natalie progressed in her early career, the absolute physical cruelty of this arrangement was about to be exposed on the set of a film called The Green Promise, where her mother's greed would leave her permanently, physically scarred. To fully grasp the absolute cruelty of the adult system that controlled Natalie Wood, we must peel back the glossy veneer of the post-war Hollywood studio system and examine the industrial reality of child labor in the late 1940s. The public was fed a diet of Shirley Temple-esque mythology. The idea that child stars were pampered, universally adored cherubs who treated the sound stages like massive magical playgrounds. The truth was far more sinister. Child actors were highly vulnerable, easily intimidated workers entirely devoid of union protections, forced to navigate a high-pressure corporate environment governed by ruthless production schedules. They were entirely dependent on their parents to act as their advocates. But for Natalie Wood, her parent was not an advocate. Her parent was her chief exploiter. By 1949, the Zakharenko family, now operating under the completely manufactured studio-sanctioned brand of Wood, was financially dependent on the income generated by their 10-year-old daughter. Maria Zakharenko had successfully transitioned from an impoverished immigrant to the fearsome manager of a highly lucrative child asset. This financial dynamic fundamentally corrupted the maternal bond. Maria did not view Natalie's physical safety as her primary responsibility. Her primary responsibility was protecting the studio paycheck. This horrifying inversion of maternal duty culminated on the set of an independent film titled The Green Promise. The Green Promise was not a prestigious, big-budget studio epic. It was a modest production, which meant the budget was tight. The shooting schedule was aggressively compressed, and the margins for error were razor-thin. Independent directors lacked the massive financial safety nets of MGM or Warner Brothers, making them notoriously impatient with delays. The script required a sequence that was inherently dangerous, especially for a 10-year-old girl. It called for Natalie's character to navigate a severe rainstorm and cross a precarious, collapsing suspension bridge, suspended directly over a raging, rushing river. To execute this sequence, the special effects department constructed a practical set. They built a rickety bridge over a tank filled with dark, churning, violently agitated water. Consider the profound, paralyzing psychological terror this specific scenario inflicted upon Natalie. For years, her mother had systematically brainwashed her with the Harbin prophecy, actively infecting her with a crippling, morbid phobia of dark water. The child believed with the absolute, unquestioning certainty of youth that deep, dark water was a lethal monster destined to kill her. And yet, she was led to the edge of a violently churning tank and ordered to run across a collapsing structure directly above it. She was hysterical. She was physically trembling, paralyzed by the exact phobia her mother had deliberately engineered. A functioning, empathetic parent would have immediately intervened, pulled the child from the set, and demanded the director use a stunt double or an optical illusion to achieve the shot. The child was experiencing severe psychological distress, but Maria Zakharenko did not intervene to protect her daughter. Instead, she demanded compliance. Maria was acutely aware that independent directors operating on tight budgets despised delays. She was terrified that if Natalie refused to perform the stunt, the director, William D. Russell, would deem the 10-year-old too difficult to manage. She feared he would fire Natalie on the spot, recast the role with a more compliant child, and the family would lose their critical source of income. Driven by this financial terror, Maria forced her terrified, sobbing 10-year-old daughter onto the bridge. She weaponized her maternal authority to override the child's fundamental survival instincts. The cameras rolled, the artificial rain poured down, and the machinery churning the dark water was activated. Natalie, desperate to please her mother and terrified of the consequences of failure, began to run across the wet, slippery planks of the suspension bridge. The stunt had been poorly engineered. The mechanical timing for the bridge's collapse was flawed. As the 10-year-old girl ran across the structure, the rigging gave way prematurely. The bridge violently collapsed beneath her feet. Natalie plummeted. She did not fall into the water, but she swung violently against the rigid, unyielding structural support beams of the set. She extended her left arm in a desperate attempt to brace herself against the impact. The sheer force of her body weight colliding with the solid wood snapped the bones in her left wrist. It was not a minor fracture. It was a severe, traumatic break. The pain was instantaneous and blinding. Natalie collapsed, weeping hysterically, clutching her shattered wrist in absolute agony. The production ground to a halt. In any modern workplace, or indeed in any environment governed by basic human empathy, this catastrophic injury would trigger an immediate medical emergency. The director would halt filming, paramedics would be summoned, and the child would be rushed to the nearest hospital for orthopedic surgery to properly set the shattered bones. But the environment on the set of The Green Promise was governed by a ruthless, sociopathic pragmatism spearheaded by Maria Zakharenko. When Maria reached her agonizing, weeping daughter, she did not offer comfort. She did not call for a doctor. She looked at the child's shattered wrist, then looked at the furious, impatient director and made a cold-blooded financial calculation. If the studio realized the extent of the injury, production would be indefinitely suspended. The studio insurance would become involved, the film might be scrapped, and Natalie would be labeled a physical liability. Maria gripped her 10-year-old daughter and issued a terrifying command. She ordered Natalie to stop crying immediately. She explicitly forbade the child from telling the director, the crew, or the studio executives how severely she was injured. She ordered her daughter to swallow the excruciating physical agony, mask the pain with a smile, and finish the scene. Natalie Wood, conditioned to obey her mother's terrifying dictates and desperate to secure her mother's conditional love, complied. She suppressed her tears. She held her shattered, throbbing wrist against her body, walked back in front of the heavy studio cameras, and finished the day's filming. The physical consequences of this maternal betrayal were permanent and devastating. Because Maria absolutely refused to take Natalie to a hospital for fear of exposing the injury to the studio, the child was denied proper medical intervention. She was never seen by an orthopedic surgeon. Her shattered wrist was never placed in a cast to ensure the bones aligned correctly during the healing process. Left to heal entirely on its own, the severe fracture fused incorrectly. The bones in her left wrist knitted together in a jagged, distorted manner, leaving her with a severe highly visible and permanent physical deformity. The bone protruded at an unnatural, awkward angle. It was a grotesque physical scar, a permanent testament to her mother's willingness to sacrifice her child's body for a paycheck. For the rest of her entire life, Natalie Wood was forced to manage this deformity. It became a lifelong, exhausting logistical challenge. Every time she stepped onto a red carpet, every time she sat for a prestigious magazine photo shoot, and in nearly every single frame of film she shot as an adult, she had to strategically hide her left arm. She developed a signature fashion choice. She wore large, thick, heavy, chunky bracelets on her left wrist. The public, the fashion critics, and her millions of adoring fans viewed these bracelets as a glamorous, idiosyncratic style choice by a sophisticated Hollywood starlet. They praised her fashion sense. They had no idea that the heavy jewelry was not an accessory. It was a physical shield. She was using diamonds and heavy metals to hide the jagged, protruding bone that served as a daily, agonizing reminder of the day her mother chose money over her safety. But the psychological damage inflicted on the set of The Green Promise was far more insidious and deeply rooted than the physical deformity of her wrist. The incident served as a brutal foundational masterclass in the mechanics of Hollywood survival. At the age of 10, Natalie learned a devastating lesson that would permanently wire her psychological architecture. She learned that her physical pain was irrelevant. She learned that adults, even her own mother, could not be trusted to protect her. She learned that her value as a human being was entirely, exclusively tied to her ability to perform under duress without complaint. Most destructively, she learned that in order to survive in the industry, she had to become exceptionally skilled at hiding her true feelings, her pain, and her trauma behind a flawless, beautiful, highly marketable facade. This toxic conditioning created a terrifyingly compliant young woman. As she transitioned from child star to a highly bankable teenager in the 1950s, starring alongside James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause and cementing her status as a global icon in Splendor in the Grass. She carried this deep-seated compliance with her onto every soundstage. Directors absolutely loved working with Natalie Wood. She was notoriously punctual, ferociously hardworking, and completely eager to please. She never argued, she never demanded special treatment, and she never complained about the grueling hours. The studio executives praised her professionalism, entirely blind to the fact that her professionalism was actually a severe, unhealed trauma response. She was a woman constantly operating in a state of high anxiety, terrified that if she caused a delay, complained about a script, or expressed a boundary, she would be punished, discarded, and lose the validation she so desperately craved. She was a towering cinematic figure, yet internally, she remained trapped in the emotional state of that weeping 10-year-old girl on the broken bridge. She was fundamentally desperate to be loved by the authority figures who controlled her career. It was this exact manufactured vulnerability, this desperate, eager-to-please work ethic, and her profound inability to aggressively defend her own boundaries that the executives at United Artists would flawlessly weaponize against her in the early 1960s. They looked at Natalie Wood and saw a beautiful, highly bankable star who was entirely too polite and too deeply conditioned to fight back. They knew they had found the perfect victim for one of the most elaborate, humiliating artistic thefts in the history of cinema. They were preparing to steal her voice, and they knew exactly how to keep her smiling while they did it. By the dawn of the 1960s, Natalie Wood had successfully navigated the notoriously perilous transition from child star to adult leading lady. She had secured Academy Award nominations and proven her dramatic weight in complex, demanding roles alongside titans of the industry. To the outside world, she was a Hollywood royalty, possessing a level of glamour, wealth, and global adulation that most actors could only dream of. But the psychological architecture built by her mother, the deep-seated need to please authority figures, the paralyzing fear of being replaced, and the desperate, unquenchable desire for validation remained entirely intact beneath the couture gowns. She was a massive, highly bankable movie star, but internally, she was still the terrified 10-year-old girl trying to hide a broken wrist from a furious director. This inherent manufactured vulnerability made her the perfect target for one of the most elaborate, humiliating artistic deceptions in the history of cinema. In 1960, the film adaptation of the Broadway sensation West Side Story was the most coveted project in Hollywood. The modern retelling of Romeo and Juliet, set against the backdrop of gang warfare in New York, was a cultural juggernaut. Securing the lead role of Maria was not just a career milestone, it was a guaranteed place in cinematic history. Natalie Wood desperately wanted the part. She understood that portraying Maria would finally solidify her reputation, not merely as a beautiful ingenue, but as a serious, formidable theatrical talent. However, there was a massive, undeniable hurdle. Natalie Wood was a dramatic actress, not a classically trained singer. The musical score, composed by the legendary Leonard Bernstein, with lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, is notoriously difficult. It is not standard pop music. The role of Maria requires a legitimate operatic soprano range, demanding immense vocal control, breath support, and the ability to sustain incredibly high, complex notes. Natalie was entirely transparent with the film's co-director Robert Wise about her vocal limitations. She did not attempt to deceive the production. However, she was fiercely determined to do the work. She possessed the relentless, trauma-driven work ethic instilled by her mother, and she struck a deal with the studio. She agreed to take the role on the strict condition that she would be allowed to record the songs herself. She wanted the opportunity to train, to practice, and to prove that she could conquer the Bernstein score. The executives at United Artists and the musical directors agreed to her terms. They smiled, shook her hand, and welcomed her into the recording studio, but the agreement was a calculated, cold-blooded lie. The Hollywood machine operates on a potent combination of cowardice and profit. The studio executives and the musical directors, including Saul Chaplin, knew from the very first vocal test that Natalie Wood's singing voice was entirely insufficient for the demands of the film. They knew with absolute clinical certainty that her voice would never be used in the final theatrical release. But they also knew the volatile economics of the studio system. If they told their highly sensitive, insecure leading lady the truth, if they rejected her singing outright before filming began, they risked a catastrophic reaction. They feared she might lose her confidence, become uncooperative, or, worst of all, walk off the picture entirely, halting a multi-million-dollar production. Furthermore, The directors required Natalie to physically perform the act of singing on camera. To make the lip-syncing look authentic on the massive 70mm Panavision screens, the camera needed to capture the physical exertion of the actor. They needed to see the tendons in her neck strain, her chest heave with breath, and her facial muscles contort precisely as they would if she were actually hitting Bernstein's high notes. To achieve this flawless visual illusion, they needed Natalie to believe she was the singer. They needed her to sing live on the set, loudly and with total conviction to the pre-recorded playback tracks. Therefore, they chose the path of least resistance and maximum cruelty. They launched a sustained industry-wide gaslighting operation. For months, they lied to her face. Natalie threw herself into the vocal preparation with a desperate, exhausting intensity. She spent countless hours in the recording booth with vocal coaches. She sang until her vocal cords were raw, repeatedly recording the complex, demanding tracks for I Feel Pretty, Tonight, and Somewhere. Singing is an inherently vulnerable act. It exposes the raw, unedited mechanics of a person's emotion. For a woman whose entire life had been defined by hiding her true feelings behind a mask, stepping up to a microphone and pouring her genuine, unprotected emotion into those songs was a profound act of artistic bravery. Throughout this grueling process, Robert Wise, the producers, and the musical staff continuously praised her efforts. When she stepped out of the recording booth, physically exhausted and nursing a sore throat, they applauded. They actively encouraged her to keep recording, telling her how wonderful she sounded, how perfectly her tone matched the vulnerability of the character, and how proud they were of her progress. They masterfully fed her trauma-induced need for validation. They led her to firmly, completely believe that her months of agonizing hard work were paying off, and that audiences worldwide would hear her real voice in the final cut. They allowed her to physically damage her vocal cords in pursuit of a goal they had already secretly decided she would never achieve. It was a direct, horrifying echo of her mother's behavior on the set of The Green Promise. Once again, the adults in charge were perfectly willing to let Natalie physically suffer to guarantee a flawless commercial product. They waited patiently until principal photography was completely finished. They waited until Natalie had delivered all her dramatic scenes, hitting her marks, dancing the grueling choreography, and providing the stunning visual performance they required. They waited until the sets were struck and the cast was dismissed. Then, in absolute clandestine secrecy, they brought the ghost singer Marnie Nixon into the recording booth. Nixon, a highly trained, brilliant session singer with perfect pitch, was hired to systematically eradicate Natalie Wood's vocal performance. Nixon was not the villain in this scenario. She was a working musician hired to execute a technical job under strict confidentiality clauses. The villains were the executives who orchestrated the theft. Nixon spent weeks in the darkened studio, meticulously matching her professional, operatic vocals to the lip movements Natalie had already filmed. She studied the footage of Natalie's physical exertion, the breathing, the shape of her mouth, the emotional intensity of her face, and tailored her singing to perfectly sync with the visual performance. The studio effectively erased months of Natalie's grueling vocal work, deleting her audio tracks and replacing her entirely without her knowledge, her input, or her consent. Natalie Wood remained entirely ignorant of this massive betrayal until the post-production process was nearly complete. She discovered the truth not through a respectful meeting with the director, but through the careless slip of a sound technician shortly before the film was scheduled to premiere. The profound, devastating psychological impact of this discovery is difficult to overstate. It was not merely a professional disappointment. It was an act of profound public humiliation. She was a dedicated, serious actress who had worked herself to the bone, believing she was finally proving her worth and expanding her artistic range. Imagine the visceral, sickening shock of sitting in a dark screening room, watching your own face projected onto a massive screen. You watch yourself moving your lips to a song you spent months practicing, a song you poured your genuine emotion into, but the voice echoing through the theater belongs to a stranger. It is a complete, violent violation of artistic integrity. But the deepest wound was the realization of the conspiracy. When Natalie heard Marni Nixon's voice coming out of her own mouth, she instantly understood that everyone she had trusted on the set had been lying to her. The director who praised her, the musical staff who encouraged her, the executives who smiled at her, they had all known the truth while she was sweating and straining in the recording booth. She had been the subject of a cruel, industry-wide joke. They had treated her not as a respected collaborator, but as a naive, manageable asset to be manipulated and discarded the moment her visual utility was exhausted. The studio executives did not care about her pride, her effort, or her dignity. They viewed her entirely as a component part of a larger commercial machine. They needed the striking beauty of her face to sell cinema tickets, and they needed the flawless soprano of Nixon's voice to sell millions of soundtrack albums. They manufactured a perfect, highly profitable commodity, and they used deceit, emotional manipulation, and psychological abuse to achieve it. When West Side Story was released in 1961, it became a monumental, historic success. It swept the Academy Awards, winning 10 Oscars, including Best Picture. The world fell in love with Maria. Critics praised the emotional depth of the character and the soaring beauty of the musical numbers. But for Natalie Wood, the film was a permanent, highly visible monument to her own exploitation. Every time she attended a premiere, every time she heard "I Feel Pretty" playing on the radio, she was forced to swallow her humiliation and smile for the cameras. She could never publicly express her outrage or expose the studio's lies, because doing so would violate the unwritten code of the Hollywood system. A star who complains is a star who is ungrateful. Her mother had taught her to hide her pain to protect the paycheck, and the studio had just brutally reinforced that lesson on a global scale. The deception surrounding West Side Story was a devastating professional trauma, but it was merely a symptom of the larger, lifelong exploitation that defined Natalie Wood's existence. She had survived the physical abuse of her childhood and the artistic theft of her adulthood, but she could not escape the fundamental underlying terror that had been programmed into her psyche before she could even speak. The industry had stolen her voice, but the true horror of her mother's legacy was still waiting for her, quietly gathering strength in the dark, cold depths of the Pacific Ocean. The trauma of West Side Story was the devastating echo of a lifelong subjugation. Beneath the global adulation of the 1960s and 70s, the woman behind the flawless makeup remained paralyzed by her mother's engineered fears. fundamentally incapable of feeling safe. Natalie spent years and thousands of hours in intensive psychoanalysis. She was desperately trying to untangle the complex, suffocating web of fears that had been installed in her mind before she could even speak. The most prominent, terrifying thread in that web remained the Harbin prophecy. Maria Zakharenko's deliberate, cruel conditioning had worked perfectly. Despite her immense wealth, her global fame, and her access to the best psychiatric care available, Natalie Wood remained absolutely paralyzed by the fear of dark water. She would not swim in the ocean. She experienced severe panic attacks if a script required her to be near a deep body of water. She harbored a deep, morbid conviction that her death would ultimately come from the water, just as the fortune teller had supposedly predicted. This profound phobia makes the final chapter of her life entirely heartbreaking. It highlights the absolute tragedy of her lifelong conditioning to please the authority figures in her life. Natalie sought a protector, someone who could shield her from the industry and from her own terrifying anxieties. She believes she found that protector in the charismatic television and film actor Robert Wagner. Their relationship was highly publicized, glamorous, and deeply volatile. They married, divorced, and eventually remarried. But Wagner was a man who loved the ocean. He loved sailing. He owned a large, luxurious motor yacht named the Splendor. The cruel irony of this dynamic is inescapable. The woman who was clinically terrified of the dark water found herself repeatedly boarding a boat, sailing into the open ocean simply to please the man she loved. Her behavior on the Splendor was the ultimate tragic manifestation of the lesson she had learned at 10 years old on the set of The Green Promise. She swallowed her excruciating fear, masked her panic with a smile, and did what she was told to keep the peace. She prioritized the comfort of the men around her over her own fundamental psychological survival. The Thanksgiving weekend of November 1981 was meant to be a relaxing holiday excursion. Natalie, Robert Wagner, and Natalie's current co-star, Christopher Walken, boarded the Splendor and sailed to Catalina Island, a rocky enclave off the coast of Southern California. The atmosphere aboard the yacht was not relaxing. It was deeply claustrophobic and saturated with tension. The dynamics on the boat were a toxic cocktail of professional jealousy, severe alcohol consumption, and volatile egos. Wagner was reportedly deeply insecure about Natalie's professional relationship with the younger, highly acclaimed Walken. As the weekend progressed, the drinking became heavier. The confined space of the yacht magnified the animosity, and the arguments grew increasingly bitter. On the evening of November 28th, the trio went ashore to a restaurant on Catalina Island, where they consumed a massive amount of alcohol. Witnesses at the restaurant noted the palpable anger radiating from the group. They returned to the Splendor in the dark, cold hours of the night. The yacht was moored in Isthmus Cove. The water surrounding them was pitch black, freezing, and actively churning. It was the exact literal manifestation of the monsters Maria Zakharenko had invented decades earlier. The precise timeline of what occurred in the main cabin of the Splendor during the early hours of November 29th remains the subject of intense, unresolved historical controversy, reopened police investigations, and fiercely guarded Hollywood secrets. What is undeniably documented is that a furious, violent argument erupted between Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken. A wine bottle was smashed. The captain of the yacht, Dennis Davern, later testified that the aggressive confrontation eventually shifted, with Wagner turning his rage directly toward his wife. The men on that boat, her husband, her co-star, and the captain, were all physically present. Yet amidst the shouting, the broken glass, and the heavy intoxication, a profound, tragic failure of protection occurred. No one watched her, no one ensured her safety. The men were entirely consumed by their own egos and their own rage. Sometime during that chaotic night, Natalie Wood left the main cabin. She was wearing only a flannel nightgown, knee-high socks, and a heavy red down jacket. She stepped out onto the slick, unsteady deck of the yacht. She was alone in the dark, surrounded by the freezing Pacific Ocean. We will never know with absolute certainty the exact mechanical sequence of her fall, whether she was trying to tie up a loose dinghy that was banging against the hull, whether she was desperately trying to leave the yacht to escape the violent argument, or whether she was subjected to physical force. The ultimate outcome remains a terrifying, irrefutable fact. The woman who had suffered from a paralyzing, lifelong, mother-induced phobia of deep water went over the side of the boat. The sheer, unadulterated horror of her final moments defies adequate description. When she hit the freezing water, the shock to her system would have been immediate and catastrophic, but the physical shock was secondary to the psychological terror. She was plunged directly into the nightmare she had been conditioned to dread since she was a toddler. The dark water had finally come for her. She was not a strong swimmer. The heavy red down jacket she was wearing instantly absorbed the seawater. It did not act as a flotation device. It acted as an anchor. The waterlogged coat, weighing dozens of pounds, aggressively pulled her down into the blackness. The police reports and subsequent autopsy revealed fresh, unexplained bruises on her body and severe scratch marks on the side of the inflatable dinghy found drifting nearby. These details paint a grim, horrifying picture of a desperate struggle for survival. She fought. She clawed at the rubber side of the dinghy, her fingernails scraping against the material, screaming into the darkness for the men on the yacht to save her. But the music was playing loudly in the cabin. The argument had consumed the atmosphere, and the Hollywood leading men did not come to her rescue. Natalie Wood drowned in the cold, black ocean off Catalina Island. She was 43 years old. The terrifying prophecy that her mother had used to control her as a helpless child became her literal, inescapable death sentence. The phobia that was implanted as a mechanism of parental control became the very instrument of her demise. Her entire life, from the changed name to the shattered wrist to the stolen voice to the final agonizing moments in the Pacific Ocean, was entirely shaped, exploited, and ultimately ended by the ambitions, the lies, and the failures of the people who were supposed to protect her. The aftermath of her death perfectly mirrored the cowardice and the efficiency of the Hollywood system she had served her entire life. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department initially conducted a remarkably swift, remarkably deferential investigation. Within days, the death was officially ruled an accidental drowning. The bruised body, the scratched dinghy, and the conflicting stories of the heavily intoxicated men on the boat were rapidly swept under the rug of official bureaucracy. The system protected its own. Robert Wagner was a powerful, highly bankable television star. A messy, protracted homicide investigation or a public trial regarding criminal negligence would have been disastrous for the industry's image and its financial bottom line. Just as the executives at United Artists had quietly erased her voice to protect their investment in West Side Story, the legal and social apparatus of Hollywood quietly erased the disturbing circumstances of her death to protect the surviving leading man. The industry demanded a clean, tragic narrative, a beautiful movie star taken too soon by a terrible accident, and they aggressively enforced that narrative for decades. It was not until 2011, 30 years after her death, that the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department finally reopened the investigation, reclassifying the cause of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. They formally named Robert Wagner a person of interest, but the bureaucratic reclassification offered no genuine justice, and it could not rewrite history. The damage was permanent. When we analyze the historical consequences and the lasting significance of Natalie Wood's trajectory, it serves as a permanent damning indictment of the machinery of fame. The cultural history of cinema frequently romanticizes the mid-century studio system, celebrating the flawless glamour and the immortal performances captured on celluloid. But the story of Natalie Wood demands that we look directly at the human wreckage left behind by that machinery. She was a pioneer in a terrifying frontier of modern celebrity, exposing the catastrophic intersection of parental abuse, corporate exploitation, and psychological conditioning. She was built into a global titan, systematically robbed of her autonomy, placed in a beautiful glass cage for the world to admire, and left entirely defenseless when the glass finally broke. The glittering romantic glamour of classic cinema is frequently just a highly produced smokescreen, meticulously designed to hide the deep, unhealed wounds of the human beings trapped inside the frame. Natalie Wood gave the world her beauty, her formidable talent, and her entire existence. But the film industry and her family ensured she paid for that legacy with her dignity, her voice, and ultimately, her life. The tragedy of Natalie Wood is not merely that she drowned in the dark water. The true tragedy is that from the moment she was born, she was never truly allowed to breathe.